Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So, we were discussing about corporate governance in the last class. We've discussed what do we understand by corporate governance and what are some of the principles of corporate governance, as well as what is the need or the requirement for corporate governance in a country such as India, how it can help in better brand reputation, it can help in ensuring that public service delivery can be improved, it can minimize the risks which are associated with the various stakeholders of a particular corporate entity, and a number of other added benefits as well. And we have also discussed what are some of the provisions that exist in the law. For example, in the last class, I discussed with you the provisions that exist in the Companies Act of 2013. If you look at Schedule 4, with respect to the independent directors of a particular corporate entity, that is one of the important measures that have been taken in the law recently in order to ensure corporate governance. Some of the provisions are, as I have told you, that there should be representation of women in the boards of the companies to ensure greater gender representation. And that is why in the Companies Act of 2013, certain class of companies, women directors have been made compulsory. Apart from it, we have also discussed the concept of the independent directors, and when directors would act as the conscience of the company, and they would be removed only in a certain manner, and the appointment is supposed to be carried out in a certain manner, etc., and all of those things with respect to the independent directors. Then apart from it, every company must appoint an individual or a firm as an auditor for that particular corporate entity, right? And the responsibility of the audit committee of the corporate entity has also been increased, has also been made more in respect of how the audit of a particular company is carried out, and if there are any chinks in the armor, if there are any problems that exist in the way the audit has been carried out, if there are any reforms or changes which are required, all of those things are supposed to be performed by the audit committee. Apart from that, every company is supposed to file their returns with the registrar of the companies as well under the Companies Act of 2013. So the disclosures that are supposed to be made to the registrar of the companies and the compliances with those particular disclosures have been made particularly strict when it comes to the returns that have to be submitted to the registrar of the companies every year. Plus, apart from that, SEBI has also tightened the screws on the publicly listed companies in the last few years so as to avoid any kind of scams or any kind of scandals which have been witnessed in the Indian capital markets or in the Indian stock markets in the last couple of decades. So that is also another thing. Then apart from it, every company has to make sure that annually they make a disclosure in their annual report to the shareholders, to the various stakeholders, what their financial situation is. They are supposed to make an accurate disclosure, more importantly, of the performance of that company with respect to various figures, and what is the ownership structure of that company, what are the various governance initiatives that have been taken in that company as well. And not just that, but it's important to have whistleblower mechanisms also within corporate entities so as to ensure that if there are any wrongdoings that are happening in the corporate entity, they can be exposed and they can be brought to light for the understanding of the other stakeholders. We must keep in mind that changes have been made with respect to the whistleblower policy as well. And it is because of such change, because of strong whistleblower policies, that we have been able to come across the various frauds that were happening in companies such as ILNFS, various frauds that were happening in companies such as, for that matter, even the Ranbaxy. It was a whistleblower only in Ranbaxy's case that came out with the wrongdoings that were happening in the company, and as a result of that, a number of inquiries were instituted against the company and all of that. So that is a very important aspect of how corporate governance is supposed to be carried out. So it is a mandatory provision which has now been included by the SEBI, especially on the public listed companies, that they need to have a mechanism, they need to have a vigilance mechanism within the organization to report any wrongdoings or any unethical conduct which has been carried out by the company's management or the senior leadership. So these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind of the provisions that have been included in the Companies Act. And again, simply stating these provisions would not be enough in the exam. You must give examples that we have discussed, or some of the examples that you come across while you read the newspapers. Otherwise, do not expect that you will be getting marks just for simply stating the provisions, or you will be getting the marks simply for stating some of the principles, because everyone would be doing that. How do you make your answers stand apart from the rest of the crowd? Anyway, so these are the principles, or these are the aspects that have been included in the Indian law as far as the corporate governance is concerned. Now, before we move over to talk about the recommendations that have been provided by the Kota committee, which was set up with respect to introducing corporate governance in India, let's quickly discuss about what are some of the challenges that India faces as far as corporate governance front is concerned. So, you may therefore give the heading challenges with respect to corporate governance in India. Okay, so challenges. So what are some of the challenges which are faced with respect to corporate governance in India? Let us discuss those. So the one aspect of the challenges of corporate governance, and these are we can say very similar to why there is a reason for adopting the corporate governance principles or requirement for adopting corporate governance principles in India. Despite the fact that many of the companies in India, which were started by specific family groups or by specific individual promoters, have now been listed as public companies, these companies continue to be governed largely by those particular families only. So the point that I'm trying to make is that despite the fact that many family owned businesses in India have gone public now and have raised money through the stock markets, through the equity markets, despite the fact, despite that particular fact, these companies largely are run, are governed as per the whims and the fancies of particular families and particular promoters. And that makes it very difficult to ensure that the corporate governance principles are adhered to in India. So the first aspect that you can write down is that most of the businesses continue to be controlled by the families. Most of the businesses continue to be controlled by the families. Controlled by the families despite going public. Despite going public. Despite going public. As a result, it is a common practice as a result, it is a common practice for the families and the friends of the promoters from the families and the friends of the promoters to be continue to be appointed as appointed as board members. To be continued promoters to be continue to be appointed as board members. So now, how do we address this problem? One of the ways to address this problem is that possibly, just like we have the rankings for the companies in terms of their sustainability practice, today we have started to come out with a green index for the companies with respect to the environmental practices, friendly practices that are adopted by the companies. We could perhaps have a rating for the diversity of the boards as well. So you please write down, इसका resolution क्या है? What is the solution? We may adopt a system of rankings we may adopt a system of rankings to rank the diversity of corporate boards, and publish them for the investors and the other stakeholders. Right, so one of these solutions could be having a diversity ranking for the boards of the various companies, corporate entities, so that the shareholders, the investors can make a more informed decision with respect to which company they want to invest in. Next, please write down. The founders, irrespective of their legal position, and I'll explain to you what this means. The founders, irrespective of their legal position, continue to exercise a significant influence on the key business decisions, and the corporate entities have failed to realize the importance of succession planning. So you see, the entire succession planning in corporate entities in India is also something which is a big problem. Various times you will see that people, those who were promoters of a particular corporate entity, when they started it, even though they have retired from the active position in that company long ago, they continue to exercise a considerable influence on the decision making of that particular company or corporate entity. And this basically results in a situation where decisions are taken by specific individuals without having any kind of responsibility for those decisions. And one more thing that we must keep in mind with respect to these corporate entities is that they haven't really, one of the reasons why they do not have anyone else to go back to, and they keep going back to the same old people for the various problems that this corporate entity faces, is because they have not invested a lot of time and energy into succession planning as to what is going to happen once the first generation of the leadership of the company retires. Every leader must have the quality of being able to develop second generation of the leadership as well after them, so that the organization which they have grown with their own hands can continue to thrive and survive beyond their lifetime or beyond their active career as well. So what is going to be the resolution or the solution to this particular problem? Please write down. It is in the best interest of such organizations it is in the best interest of such organizations to evolve a succession plan and to implement it effectively. Right. So, like for example, even if you see the entire the Ratan Tata and the Cyrus Mistry fiasco in case of the Tata group of companies or the Tata Sons, that is one example of how the companies or corporate entities or corporate boards should not run. We were discussing in the last class about how independent directors themselves, their removal is subject to the majority resolution of the board of directors, and therefore a lot of times they also work under the influence of specific promoters. In case of the Cyrus Mistry and Ratan Tata fiasco, the removal of Cyrus Mistry as the CEO of the organization was criticized by a few independent directors in the board of directors. And there are no prizes for guessing that what happened to those independent directors. They were themselves removed after they criticized the removal of Cyrus Mistry as the CEO of the organization. So these things need to go away. And for that, it's important to have certain robust checks and balances to prevent the misuse of the powers by certain promoters or certain investors of the corporate entity, so that it can work in a very well-rounded manner. So ये examples आपको देने पड़ेंगे exam के अंदर. Anyway, next please write down. Often corporate entities have been found to work in the interest of Often, corporate entities have been found to work in the interest of a few powerful people. Have been found to work in the interest of a few powerful people, compromising the interest of the other stakeholders. Compromising the interest of the other stakeholders. See, for example, there were a number of faulty management practices that were prevalent at ILNFS. If you have read the newspapers, if you have been abreast of what has happened in the news, then it was because of the faulty management practices that were prevalent at ILNFS, and despite those faulty practices, the board of directors never raised an alarm over what wrong was happening within the organization. And that is what led to the downfall of the organization. Even if you again look at the entire Tata Mistry fiasco, Tata Nano was a failed project. It was a personal aspiration of Ratan Tata. To the company, it brought a lot of losses. But it was at the whim and the fancy of one person that the organization was made to suffer losses, and the other stakeholders of the organization were made to suffer losses. Ideally, this should be avoided. Not just that, but the investment into the Kingfisher Airlines, the United Breweries by the Tatas was also another, not by Tata, sorry, by the United Breweries into the Kingfisher Airlines is also another example of how at the personal whims and fancies, because of the personal aspirations of a particular person, the entire organization was made to suffer. Even in the case of Cyrus Mistry, when he was appointed as the CEO, the bylaws of the organization were changed in such a manner so as to give more control to the board of directors over the CEO, which was not the case earlier, where there was a certain amount of autonomy which the CEO had as to the day-to-day functioning of the organization. And This was again something which was done possibly at the behest of one person within the organization. So you may write down, for example, no alarm was raised by the board of directors. No alarm was raised by the board of directors over the faulty management practices. Over the faulty management practices prevalent at over the faulty management practices prevalent at ILNFS. Over the faulty management practices prevalent at ILNFS. Some people look at me as if I have said name of some bacteria which you have not known. See, it shows that you don't read newspapers. That's all. Anyway, so no ILNFS. Right. So one issue that we have discussed is diversity rankings. Another issue that we have discussed is succession planning. Another issue that we have discussed is that how the interest of specific group of people or specific individuals are given more importance over one organization. Another example that you can write down is the head of ICICI Bank, the CEO of ICICI Bank, the entire Chanda Kochar issue. The head of ICICI Bank approved loans to Videocon. Approved the loans to Videocon without following due diligence measures. Without following due diligence measures. Without following due diligence measures, as she had an indirect interest. As she had an indirect interest. As she had an indirect interest in Videocon, because her husband was there on the board of directors of the Videocon, so there were certain rules that were flouted, certain due diligence measures that were flouted to extend the loans to Videocon, right? So as she had an indirect interest in Videocon. So what can be the resolution? So you please write down, or what can be the solution to this kind of a problem? Corporate entities must adhere to strict principles of transparency. Corporate entities must adhere to strict principles of transparency and accountability. Transparency and accountability in letter as well as spirit. In letter as well as spirit. Then next, please write down. Despite the presence of the independent directors, the functioning of the board has been compromised time and again. The functioning of the boards has been compromised time and again. The functioning of the board has been compromised time and again. The independence of such promoter appointed directors is questionable. The independence of such promoter appointed directors is questionable. Promoter appointed directors is questionable. Not only that, some independent directors have been removed. Not only that, some independent directors have been removed merely because they did not comply with the decisions of certain promoters. Merely because they did not comply with the decisions of certain promoters. है ना, तो ऐसे बोर्ड्स जहां पर डायरेक्टर्स को प्रमोटर्स ही अपॉइंट कर रहे हैं वो अवॉइड करना जरूरी है. और independence of the independence directors itself has also come under a question which needs to be addressed. So what can be the solution? You please write down. The powers provided to the promoters. The powers provided to the promoters with respect to removal of directors should be limited. With respect to the removal of directors should be limited. SEBI has proposed the adoption of stricter transparency norms. As well as an independent mechanism for the removal of the independent directors. For the removal of the independent directors. Right? So we need to have stricter norms. We need to have more transparent measures with respect to how the removal of the directors happens within the organizations, especially the independent directors. The board of directors should not be working under the control of the promoters of the organization alone. Next, please write down. Corporate entities stand exposed due to stand exposed to different risks. Stand exposed stand exposed uh, sorry corporate entities stand exposed to different risks due to due to faulty investments. Due to faulty investments, often often made due to vested interests. Often made due to vested interests. Therefore, exposing even the retail investors. Therefore, exposing even the retail investors to significant risks. To significant risks. So what I was telling you, how the investment was made by the United Breweries in the Kingfisher Airlines and how due diligence measures were not followed in this particular case, therefore putting several retail investors of the organization also at a great risk. So what can be the solution to this? Please write down. Corporate entities must evolve a robust risk management policy. Must evolve robust risk management policies must evolve robust risk management policies to minimize such risks. To minimize such risks in the future. To minimize such risks in the future. Right, so it is very important to have robust risk management policies as well in place in organizations so as to ensure that they take calculated risks when they are making investments, because there is a lot of interest of various stakeholders which is also connected with such investments which are made by any corporate entity. Next, please write down. Corporate entities have been guilty of offering exorbitant compensation. Corporate entities have been guilty of offering exorbitant compensation to senior executives, even at the cost of other stakeholders. Even at the cost of the other stakeholders. So corporate entities in India have often, despite being in doldrums, despite not doing well financially, have ended up paying an exorbitant amount of compensation to the individual senior executives in the organization, and these practices need to be need to be checked within the corporate entities, especially when it comes at the cost of hurting the interest of other stakeholders. So you please write down, companies must consider companies must consider framing fair remuneration policies, framing fair remuneration policies, fair remuneration policies that should also require would also require the approval of shareholders. Right? So it's important for corporate entities to evolve fair remuneration policies so that the remuneration that is offered to the senior executives is not at the cost of the interest of the other stakeholders within the organization. Right? So that's one. Then next, please write down. Corporate entities often fail to comply with disclosure and accountability norms. Disclosure and accountability norms. In certain cases, violation of basic guidelines. In certain cases, violation of basic guidelines have been flouted, which have remained unpunished, and even the independence and even the independence of the auditors. And even the independence of the auditors has been compromised. तो इसका solution क्या हो सकता है? एक, to improve the accountability standards, the entire board of directors must be present at the general meetings, to give the stakeholders an opportunity to interact. With them, as well as as well as to pose or to ask questions. To pose or to ask questions to them. Please read what you have written once. What are the various problems, challenges with respect to corporate governance? And the remedies that we have written. Right, so these are some of the challenges as well as some of the measures that can be taken up in order to address the challenges associated with corporate governance in India. Now, let's quickly have a look at what are the recommendations that have been made by some of the expert committees in this regard. If you go through your material, you will find some of the recommendations by the Mangalam committee as well, Kumar Mangalam committee as well, on corporate governance and what are some of the measures that can be taken. And you can incorporate those as well in your answers. So these are things that you should incorporate as far as your answers are concerned. If there are reforms or if you are asked solutions or the way forward with respect to corporate governance in India or to address some of the challenges that India faces as far as corporate governance is concerned. Now, the Kotak committee extensively examined the problems which are faced by the corporate entities in India and which prevents them from following the standards of corporate governance. And they have laid down a number of measures as well that should be followed by the corporate governance or the corporate entities in India. One of them is that they have talked about the strengthening of the institution of the independent directors in the publicly listed corporate entities. As of now, in the publicly listed corporate entities, at least 1/3 of the directors in the board of directors have to be independent directors. But the Kotak committee has recommended that the strength should be increased from the present 33% to 50%. And the idea would essentially be to protect the interest of the small investors in a particular corporate entity. Apart from that, they have also stated that the presence of the independent directors must be made mandatory, at least a certain percentage at board meetings of any company, so that no meetings of a board of a company can proceed unless there is a meeting of some of the, unless there is a presence of some of the board of directors of independent directors on the board of directors meeting. Then they have also suggested that they made certain measures, suggested certain measures, and we have not gone into details of that. अगर आप इंटरनेट पर सर्च करेंगे तो आपको कोटक कमेटी की recommendations डिटेल में भी मिल जाएंगी. But even if you just mention this much in your answer, that they have made certain measures, suggested certain measures with respect to how the removal of the independent directors should happen. They have suggested certain measures with respect to the appointment of the independent directors at the organization. That should also be enough to drive home the point to the examiner. Apart from that, they have stated that the audit committee of the corporate entities should be given the responsibility of looking into utilization of funds, money, which has been infused by a listed entity into an unlisted subsidiary, including the foreign subsidiary. So what I mean to say is that, let us say that there is a publicly listed company. Now that has raised money from the people, and that is governed according to the SEBI guidelines and a number of other guidelines that have been laid down by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in India or the Registrar of Companies in India. But there is a problem. What if these publicly listed companies invest the money which they have raised through public sources in those companies which are not listed publicly, or subsidiaries of foreign companies which are not listed in India. Now, these companies in which the money will be invested of people are not governed by SEBI norms, are not governed by strict norms of compliance, which the publicly listed companies have to go through. As a result of that, there is always a risk that the money which has been invested by these publicly listed companies in unlisted companies may turn out to be bad investments. Therefore, exposing the stakeholders of these publicly listed companies to a lot of risk. So, ideally, audit committee of various corporate entities must scrutinize any such investments which have been made by a publicly listed company into an unlisted company or a foreign subsidiary which do not come under such compliances as the parent company does. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here, right? So, therefore, it has also covered issues with respect to accounting and auditing practices by the listed companies. It has tried to provide recommendations so as to improve the way the board evaluation is carried out in corporate entities. They have also talked about given or laid down measures, suggested measures to strengthen the functioning of the regulator, which is essentially SEBI in case of the publicly listed companies and registrar of companies in case of all the companies. So it has suggested strengthening the role of the market regulator to improve the governance practices at listed entities. SEBI should have the power, according to the recommendation provided by the Kota committee, to act against auditors if the need arises, if they have not followed due diligence procedure while carrying out the audit. SEBI should develop capabilities to be able to regulate listed companies more effectively and to protect the interest of the small shareholders. So as of now, it is not just a problem of SEBI not having enough rules or not having enough regulations and powers in its hands to take action, but it is also because that the SEBI does not have the capacity to be able to deal with the volume of publicly listed companies in India and to keep a check, a strict vigil on the practices that are followed by them. So there is a need to essentially enhance the capacity of SEBI, ideally by recruiting more staff, by setting up more regional offices of SEBI that would be responsible for ensuring adherence to various norms that have been laid down by the organization, by the regulator, to be followed by various listed companies. Then apart from that, they have talked about certain other reforms as well. You can read it on your own. They have talked about that board should have a final say on the appointment of the independent directors with respect to the PSUs. तो बहुत बार क्या होता है, जो पब्लिक सेक्टर यूनिट्स होती हैं सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट की, स्टेट गवर्नमेंट्स की, उसमें जो गवर्नमेंट की मिनिस्ट्री होती है वही यूजुअली डिसाइड करती है कि इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर कौन होगा. अब आप सोच सकते हैं कि गवर्नमेंट किन लोगों को इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर्स अपॉइंट करेगी पीएसयूज का. दे आर पीपल those who are sycophants of the government. They are people, those who are chamchas of the government. So in that particular case, even if there are faulty practices that are taking place at the PSUs, nothing would be brought to light. Ultimately, the sufferer would be the citizen. So we need to keep a check on this as well, and those are some of the measures that have been talked about. Plus, you please do have a look at the recommendations that you will find in your material provided by the Kumar Mangalam committee as well. Now, let's move further with the last concept under the idea of corporate governance. On this as well, you will find that a few questions have been asked by UPSC. What is corporate social responsibility? So, see, one responsibility that any corporate entity has is to follow the rules, the regulations, the compliances that have been made for any corporate entity to follow. That is one basic responsibility. We have talked about that corporate governance refers to legality, transparency and all of those things. So that they have to follow anyway. But apart from that, corporate entities should look beyond their legal purpose or their legal justification as well. तो ये भी बहुत important है कि corporate entities अपनी legal principles या जो उनकी legal requirements हैं उसके beyond भी देखना चालू करें. They start looking beyond those legal requirements as well. And that is where it is very important that the corporate entities must look into trying to ensure the well-being of the society. The corporate entities must invest money in social upliftment. Corporate entities must invest money in social activities, in uplifting the status of the society, in addressing the problems which are faced by the employees, by the customers, by the society in general. That is what corporate social responsibility. So what is corporate social responsibility? Corporate social responsibility is nothing, but it is also referred to as corporate citizenship. It is a concept, or it is the processes that an organization must adopt so that it thinks about and it evolves its relationship with various stakeholders for the common good, and demonstrates its commitment in this respect by adopting practices, business processes, and strategies which are sustainable, which are environment friendly, which are investing in the upgradation of the capability and the well-being of the society, which invests consistently in social reforms as well. So CSR is not necessarily just about charity. It is not just about investing money or giving money to some NGO or to some philanthropic organization, but rather a way of conducting business by which corporate entities contribute to the social good. A socially responsible company, corporate entity, should not be limited to using resources to engage in activities that only increase their profits. They must use CSR to integrate economic, environmental, and social objectives within the company's operations and growths. So the point is that corporate social responsibility is nothing, but it is the responsibility of a corporate entity to give back to the society. It is the responsibility of a corporate entity to show their commitment to the larger goals of the society, apart from just making profits. It is the commitment to be shown by a corporate entity to environmental objectives, a commitment showed by the corporate entities to various social objectives. That is what corporate social responsibility is. Right? I see that again some of you just don't care to write it down. I am not going to be dictating this. Okay? So that's your choice. Anyway, so now that is what is the meaning of the term corporate social responsibility. Now, if we talk about, usually corporate social responsibility means when a corporate entity invest money in some philanthropic activities, when they give certain donations to NGOs, when they give some money to the poor and the needy. But corporate social responsibility as a concept should be looked beyond just merely giving donations, just making contributions to NGOs or to philanthropic activities. It should include a number of other things as well. For example, corporate social responsibility should also focus on a particular corporate entity to be promoting business ethics, it should also focus on any corporate entity to follow compliances, standards, legal rules, एक्सेट्रा. तो ये भी कॉर्पोरेट सोशल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी का एक हिस्सा होना चाहिए, ना कि केवल फिलैंथ्रोपिक एक्टिविटी करना या डोनेशन करना या चैरिटी करना. सो दैट इज वन. Corporate social responsibility means that you should have a larger responsibility towards the society, which means that you have a larger responsibility of setting a positive work culture at your workplace so that the society can benefit from the same. Therefore, corporate social responsibility should also mean that a corporate entity should play an important role in promoting employee welfare. a corporate entity should play an important role in promoting work life balance for the employees of that particular organization, providing them enough rest, enough opportunities to grow, to be able to rejuvenate themselves so that they can come back to work fresher and with more vigor and energy. They must not only focus on these aspects of employee welfare and of ensuring compliance to business ethics, they must also try to influence the other players in the supply chain to adopt more ethical and environmental friendly practices. So corporate entity should also, of course, do this internally, but other stakeholders, especially within the supply chain, whether it is the supplier of that particular corporate entity, whether it is the end manufacturer of that corporate entity, if that corporate entity is a supplier, or the retailers, wholesalers, they must also try to adopt sustainable practices, ethical business practices. That is where the corporate entities corporate social responsibility can come in. So, the another aspect is that they must influence various players in the supply chain to adopt ethical and sustainable business practices. Another important thing is that often for corporate entities, there are certain basic guidelines that are laid down in the law, in the rules and the regulations as to what they should do to ensure that the environmental sustainability can be ensured, what they should do in order to ensure ecological preservation. But often these guidelines, these standards which are laid down in the law are a bare minimum. Ideally, corporate social responsibility should mean that a corporate entity must go beyond legal rules, compliances, especially with respect to ecological conservation and sustainability practices. So that's another important point which one can write down, that they must go beyond, right? So they must go beyond legal compliances with respect to environmental and sustainable solutions. And sustainable solutions. And then lastly, they must make a positive impact on the lives of the local community and support community empowerment as well. So must support community empowerment, must invest in upliftment of the local community. Right? So you may write down one question. Usually, corporate social responsibility or CSR is understood as the spending of funds for charitable purposes, by a corporate entity. By a corporate entity. In this context, analyze whether there is a need to look at a broader definition. There is a need to consider a broader definition. Of the term corporate social responsibility. Broader definition of the term corporate social responsibility. Full stop. Next part में इसमें इसी क्वेश्चन में लिखिएगा, what are some of the requirements laid down under the Companies Act 2013. For promoting CSR. So according to the section 135 of Companies Act of 2013, India has introduced mandatory CSR for a certain category of companies. Companies that fall under any of these categories must create a CSR committee that must consist of at least 3 directors of the company, out of which at least 1 must be an independent director, and this company is supposed to take decisions with respect to the way the company is supposed to spend money on the CSR. Now, what is the provision which has been made? According to section 135 of the Act, the provision that has been made is that companies that have a net worth of 500 crores or more, or that have an annual turnover of 1000 crore or more, or that have a net profit of 5 crores or more, over the last 3 years, whatever their average profits have been of last 3 years, they must spend 2% of their average annual profits of last 3 years mandatorily on CSR activities. On what activities exactly can they spend on will be determined by the CSR committee of that organization, of that particular corporate entity. But some of the broad categories or broad definition which have or broad areas on which this CSR funding can be spent include areas such as livelihood, health, education, sanitation, women empowerment, gender equity, right? Legal awareness. These are some of the areas on which companies can be spending this CSR money, right? So these are the companies that fall under the ambit of the CSR in India, and they are supposed to spend an average of 2% of their last 3 years profit is what we need to keep in mind. Now, as I said, that every company that falls under this particular definition must form a CSR committee. This CSR committee will, as I said, comprise of 3 or more directors of that company, and at least one must be an independent director. The report, the composition of the board or of the committee should be reported in the annual report of that particular organization to the stakeholders, to the various shareholders, etc. And they must spend, as I said, at least 2% of their average annual profits of the last 3 years. Some of the activities which are permitted under the CSR ambit of the mandatory CSR provisions are as promotion of education, eradicating hunger and poverty, gender equality, women empowerment, improvement in maternal health, so environmental sustainability. They can contribute to the Prime Minister's National Relief Fund, etc. as a part of their CSR contribution. If companies do not follow this, then there can be penalties which can also be levied on them. Also, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs issues rules from time to time which are called as CSR rules under this particular section of the Companies Act, section 135, which lay down the finer details with respect to how this law is supposed to be implemented. Now, some people actually have opposed this idea of mandatory CSR. One of the reasons for that is because they say that charity, philanthropy should never be made mandatory. It should be as per the choice of the person who is doing so. We have always had a concept where people say that if your right hand is donating, your left hand should not know. But when you are imposing a compulsory requirement on organizations to make a mandatory requirement or to make a mandatory contribution to CSR activities, the essence of philanthropy, the essence of doing good for the society is taken away, because you do it not out of your own will, but out of compulsion. So the intention and the good part of the intention or the ethical part of the intention goes missing when you are forced to do this. Some people also say that it is a problem because now with this mandatory requirement being put into place, companies end up spending only 2% of their average annual profits on CSR, whereas earlier some of them used to spend way beyond this 2% limit. तो जब मैंडेटरी रिक्वायरमेंट नहीं था तो कंपनी ज्यादा पैसे खर्च करती थी, और आज मैंडेटरी रिक्वायरमेंट होने के बाद लोग या कंपनीज कम पैसा खर्च करते हैं. थर्ड इज दैट another problem which has cropped up is that many companies now spend money under CSR just for the compliance purpose, and their goal is never necessarily to actually do something good out of that money. So they often just try to find NGO partners, civil society organizations to whom they can give their CSR money, and they don't really bother about how the company is being covered, how the money is being put to use. तो उनका बस ऑब्जेक्टिव यहीं तक लिमिटेड होता है कि हमने क्या अपनी ऑब्लिगेशन फुलफिल कर दी कि नहीं, क्या हमने कॉर्पोरेट एंटिटीज होने के जो हमारा मैंडेटरी रिक्वायरमेंट है उसके अकॉर्डिंग जितना भी पैसा हमें एक एनजीओ या सिविल सोसाइटी ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस को देना था, क्या हमने उतना दे दिया कि नहीं. हैज दैट बीन सेटिस्फाइड? That is more than enough. We are not really bothered about whether the real purpose with respect to spending of that corporate entity is achieved or not. By the spending of that CSR money is achieved or not. तो बहुत बार ऐसा होता है, NGOs are given money, and then that money is not put to effective use, and the corporate entities do not really bother also about how that CSR money has been put to use. So these are some of the criticisms against the mandatory CSR which was introduced in India, and India in fact became one of the first few countries in the world to introduce mandatory CSR. Right? Now, what are the advantages of CSR in general? Forget about mandatory or not mandatory. What are the advantages of the CSR provision? So let us understand that. So why any company must invest in CSR activities? अच्छा इसमें मैंने शायद नहीं लिखा. Anyway, so yeah, I've written it here. Okay. So why any corporate entity must invest in CSR or must be involved in CSR, whether mandatory or not? Firstly, CSR is based on the premise that business can only thrive if it operates within a thriving society. See, for every business to be able to thrive, they need a customer base. They need people to be coming in from the society as workforce of that organization. They also need a thriving society to get manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, suppliers for that particular corporate entity as well. And therefore, it becomes important to have a thriving society. So it says that corporate CSR is based on the premise that business can only thrive if they thrive in a thriving society. In that way, the businesses depends on the community they operate within, and as such have an ethical and moral responsibility towards the community as well. Because if you have taken something from the society, from the community, you must give back as well. And a business is perceived as as legitimate when its activities, when its goals are congruent, they are similar to the goals and the values of the society in which they operate. That is why CSR becomes so crucial. CSR can help a corporate entity in creating a thriving society and in turn helping themselves, because ultimately a thriving society would result in a thriving corporate entity as well. And also, as I said, that they have a moral responsibility. If you have drawn resources from the community and from the society, you must give back to the society as well. So it's a way for the corporate entities to give back or contribute to the society. Secondly, consumers, various other suppliers, partner agencies of any corporate entity, through various surveys it has been proven, are likely to disregard or reject or shun those firms that develop unethical reputations. We have seen that several times in the past, that various companies have suffered because of loss of reputation among the people, because of unethical practices that have been adopted by them. So, and arguably companies that don't pay attention to their social and ethical responsibilities are more likely to stumble into legal trouble such as mass corruption, accounting fraud scandals, therefore threatening the business itself. तो एक रीजन तो ये है कि अगर आप एथिकल अप्रोच अडॉप्ट करते हैं, क्या अगर आप कॉर्पोरेट सोशल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी की अप्रोच अडॉप्ट करते हैं, you'd be able to ensure the sustainability of your own business. And second, and a bigger reason, is that the customers, the consumers are more likely to be loyal to a brand which has invested in CSR activities intensively. The consumers and the customers relate more to such brands, to such organizations, which, or to such entities which invest in CSR activities. So they enjoy a stronger brand reputation and a brand image as well. Right? So there is a stronger brand recall as well, which is created because of adopting CSR practices. Then another added advantage is that by promoting respect for company in marketplaces, CSR can result in higher sales, higher profits for the organization, especially in terms of volumes. Also, it can enhance the employee satisfaction as well. and attract people with a sense of purpose, a clear motive to the corporate entities. So that is also something which is very important. And then by promoting CSR, a corporate entity can attract people, those who are also having a bent of mind which is towards making an impact on the society. Not only that, but you'd be able to keep your employees happier over a long period of time, therefore enjoying greater retention rates as well. Why? Because then employees feel a sense of purpose, a sense of satisfaction for working for such organizations that boast of a culture of investing in the CSR. So that is also something which you can mention. Apart from it, you can mention that CSR can help to ensure that companies can play a greater role in nation building as well. Companies or corporate entities do not have the role of only making money, but they also have a role to contribute to nation building just like any other individual or any other organization, and they can play that role also effectively. And then of course brand loyalty, consumer patronage, and sustainability of the business, etc., also can be ensured in the longer run when it comes to CSR, right? So यूपीएससी में आस्क यू व्हाई शुड कंपनीज बी अडॉप्टिंग सीएसआर पॉलिसीज. हो सकता है वो केस स्टडी में आपको इस तरीके का केस बना के दे दें जहां पे वो आपसे पूछे कि दिस प्रपोजल हैज कम अप फॉर इन्वेस्टमेंट इन सीएसआर and you have another proposal for investment in a new business plant. So as a MD, as a CEO of the company, what decision would you take and why? So there you can use these kind of justifications in order to justify that why you would prefer to invest in CSR activity, and that would possibly help you in setting many more plants in future as compared to investing that money in increasing your profits directly. Because CSR is also a way of increasing the profits, but indirectly, by increasing your brand reputation, by increasing the customer loyalty, by being able to attract more customers, by being able to retain the employees over a long period of time, by being able to instill a sense of motivation in the employees of any particular organization. I hope you understand this. Now, what are some of the challenges as far as the CSR activities in India are concerned? So you quickly write down challenges associated with CSR in India. Challenges associated with the CSR in India. Please write down. 85% of 85% of the CSR spending of CSR spending is focused on specific sectors such as health, education, and livelihood development, health, education, and livelihood development, leaving little or no resources leaving little or no resources for the other sectors. Leaving little or no resources for the other sectors. So there is a skewed spending on certain specific sectors in the CSR spending profile in India. As per a report that was published a couple of years back, it was pointed out that almost 85% of the funds which are made or contribution which are made under CSR by corporate entities to NGOs or charities are made under these three areas only: education, livelihood, and health. Therefore, leaving little or no money for the other sectors, and therefore showing that possibly a lot of CSR spending is made only on these, maybe because of the interest of the companies, or because it possibly is the easiest way to spend money, or because of some other reasons which are unknown. But this skewed spending pattern is a problem. This skewed spending pattern is not just sector wise but geography wise as well. Most of the CSR spending of the Indian companies is made in south and in west part of India. Eastern part of India, certain northern states in India which actually are in the need for maximum amount of CSR don't end up getting any CSR projects. Now, one reason could be that most of the industries also are located in the western and the southern part of India, and that is why they tend to spend money in their vicinity. So ये भी एक reason हो सकता है, इसमें कोई doubt नहीं है. But then, at the same time, this geographical skewedness of spending money under the CSR is also a problem. So you please write down that point as well. CSR spending is lopsided CSR spending is lopsided in geographical terms as well. In geographical terms as well. A large part, full stop, a large part a large part is focused on the western and southern parts of India. Western and southern parts of India, resulting in an unequal development. Resulting in an unequal development. Right? Unequal, lopsided, unbalanced, imbalanced regional development. Next, please write down. Corporate entities are often focused on corporate entities are often focused on merely spending the CSR funds, are often focused on merely spending the CSR funds and fulfilling the legal requirements instead of achieving instead of achieving the desired social objectives. Instead of achieving the desired social objectives. Next, please write down. So this we have discussed. I hope this is understood what we have written. Often the local communities are not involved in the CSR projects, which are primarily driven by the priorities of the corporate sector. So a lot of times you would find that CSR projects have been implemented, but there was no need for such a project in the community in the first place. Rather, there were some other pressing problems waiting to be solved. But because the corporate entity wanted to spend money in a certain manner, they ended up doing so without understanding what the priorities of that particular community or that particular geography was. And last point, please write down. Companies often end up channeling CSR funds to their own NGOs and foundations. Therefore defeating the entire purpose of the CSR. So the entire purpose of the CSR itself is defeated because of the companies opening up their own NGOs and foundations where the CSR funds are channeled. And a lot of times these CSR funds by these NGOs and foundations are spent on the employees and the children of the employees only. So then what is the purpose of creating the entire CSR facade? A lot of times this money is just, as I said, spent in a manner in which it is an eyewash for formality purposes and for just formality's sake, right? So this is something that we need to keep in mind as far as some of the challenges of the CSR in India are concerned, and there is a need to change this regime. Possibly we need to have more interventions by the government to facilitate the interaction between the NGOs, civil society organizations and corporate entities. For example, the Darpan portal is one initiative on which Ministry of Education has done a lot of good work. What they have done is that on that particular portal, they have got a number of NGOs and the corporate entities registered. And that has now become a platform. If you are an NGO that is seeking some kind of funding or some kind of money under CSR, you can approach that portal. You can then get yourself registered with Ministry of Education, and Ministry of Education will do your vetting, so that if a corporate entity is looking for organizations where they have to donate money, they are not running into fake or hoax organizations. They have verified, vetted organizations, vetted by the Ministry of Education, working in the area of education listed on this Darpan portal. And then these organizations can go there, connect with the NGOs, civil society organizations, and possibly find partners for the CSR spending which they have to make. This is therefore a win-win situation for the corporate entities as well as for the NGOs, because both of them can then find the likely partners for each other. On top of that, the government can act as a facilitator and use its expertise of being able to carry out a vet check, a vet assess on the companies or on the NGOs or the organizations, those who want to get registered. तो इस तरीके के रोल भी प्ले किए जा सकते हैं. Plus, ideally, we should try to incorporate training facilities for the various corporate entities so that the CSR committees of corporate entities can be strengthened and they can function in such a manner so as to ensure the CSR of companies can be spent effectively on various charitable purposes. Companies must move away from the idea of just spending their money in a business as usual mode, and they must spend it with a clear-cut objective of achieving certain desired social economic outcomes through spending of that CSR money. Right? So these are some of the things. Plus, if you look at your material as well, there are a few recommendations way ahead that you will find as to how to improve or strengthen the CSR regime further in India. Right? So we'll stop here, take a break here right now. There are two more topics that are remaining to be covered. One is the topic of probity in governance. It should not take a lot of time. We will just discuss what do we understand by probity in governance, what is the importance of probity in governance, which is nothing but largely the importance of foundational values of civil services or importance of ethical governance. वही सब same चीजें हैं. And then some of the measures that can be taken up in order to ensure probity in governance. And the last topic is ethics in international issues, international relations and international funding. That also should not take a lot of time. I've already shared the handout, so we will be discussing that topic also with the help of the handout. Okay, I'll see you in a few minutes. Also, you must again find examples through newspapers, and a lot of times you will find that there will be coverage given to various CSR initiatives that have been taken up by various corporate entities. You must use those examples in your answers when you are writing about CSR, advantages of CSR, etc. So many examples are there, whether it is the Tata Foundation or whether it is the initiative that have been taken by the Birla Group, or whether the initiatives that have been taken by organization in the recent past as well. For example, ITC has this ITC e-Chopal, etc. Right? So all those initiatives you can talk about. One online student had mentioned about some initiative by Mama Earth, etc. So whatever, whichever corporate entities you find CSR initiatives taken by them, if you just search on the internet, then also you'll be able to come across a number of examples. You should incorporate those into your answers. Okay, I'll see you in a few minutes. So let's quickly discuss about the topic of probity in governance. Actually, probity in governance is nothing but essentially when institutions of governance follow principles of integrity, transparency, or basically an ethical approach to the way an institution is governed. That is what is called as probity. So when we use the term integrity in case of individuals, we say that an individual is an individual of integrity if they follow the highest standards or highest principles of morality or behavior, right? And of morality, highest principles of behavior or attitude or actions is what is called as integrity. Probity is the same concept that translates to institutions or organizations. So if you say that an individual is an individual of integrity, then we simply use that term as probity in case of institutions when it comes to governance. So quickly write down the definition of the term probity in governance. Please write down. Probity in governance is the quality of having strong moral principles, such as honesty, transparency, such as honesty, transparency, accountability, objectivity in the functioning of in the functioning of in the functioning of in the functioning of an organization. In the functioning of an organization. It is an essential element in governance. Probity. It's an essential element in governance and is an important requirement for an efficient and an effective governance system. इसी में आगे लिखिएगा, an important aspect of ensuring probity in governance. An important aspect of ensuring probity in governance is the absence of corruption. So if corruption is absent from a particular organization or an institution, we can say that probity exists. But there are certain other requirements as well. Some of the other, please write down, some of the other requirements include rigorous standards of transparency and accountability. Rigorous standards of transparency and accountability. Effective implementation of rules and regulations. And adherence to highest standards of objectivity. तो प्रोबिटी कुछ नहीं है, बस बेसिकली वही सेम बात है. इट इज अडियरेंस टू हाईएस्ट स्टैंडर्ड्स ऑफ ऑब्जेक्टिविटी, ओपननेस, ट्रांसपेरेंसी, अकाउंटेबिलिटी, इंटेग्रिटी, फेयरनेस, impartiality in the way a government organization functions, compliance to rules, laws, ethical principles in the way an organization functions. That is what is probity. And a बहुत simple term है. Now, why is probity important? Same things that we have discussed. Ethical governance को important है to maintain the trust of the citizens in the government, to ensure the effective utilization of the resources, to prevent the misuse of the government resources which are limited in nature, to ensure that the governance is carried out in such a manner that it keeps in mind the concerns of the marginalized sections of the society. वही सब सेम चीजें जो हमने पहले डिस्कस करी. तो इसमें छोटा मोटा लिख लीजिएगा. आई एम जस्ट गिविंग यू एन आइडिया, बिकॉज बाद में ना कुछ स्टूडेंट्स आगे बोलते हैं सर प्रोबिटी नहीं करवाया आपने. अब एंड देन टेल देम ऑल्सो, उसी समय मैंने पिछले बैच में कुछ में बता भी दिया था कि प्रोबिटी इन गवर्नेंस इज नथिंग बट इट इज सेम थिंग एज वी हैव डिस्कस्ड एथिकल गवर्नेंस. बट दे स्टिल, I don't know, either they don't listen or they are so dumb or they just don't want to understand what is being told or they are just, मतलब पता नहीं क्या अजीब सा बीमारी है कि मटेरियल इकट्ठा करना है बहुत सारा बट कॉन्सेप्ट नहीं समझना है. कॉन्सेप्ट सेम है है ना, कोई डिफरेंस नहीं है। एनीवे तो इसलिए मैं लिखवा दे रहा हूं सो दैट आपके बैच से कोई आके मेरे को फिर बाद में ना मेरे को परेशान करे इस बात पे, है ना। सो यू प्लीज राइट डाउन इंपॉर्टेंस ऑफ प्रोबेटी इन गवर्नेंस, इंपॉर्टेंस ऑफ प्रोबेटी इन गवर्नेंस। So first, ensures effective utilization of resources. Ensures the effective utilization of resources. Simple है. Second, to develop trust, credibility and social capital. Trust in the government. To develop trust in the government, credibility as well as social capital. Next, to fulfill the expectations of the society. If your governance is going to be open, responsive, transparent, accountable, it will fulfill the expectations of the society. To fulfill the expectations of the society. Next, to ensure the well-being of the marginalized strata of the society. Equity. To ensure the well-being of the marginalized strata of the society. Next, would help in establishing model institutions of governance. Help in establishing model institutions of governance. Model institutions of governance. To ensure citizen centricity of government processes, so that government processes are citizen centric in nature. To ensure citizen centricity of government processes, of governance processes or government processes. Can help in attracting the best talent to public sector organizations. Can help in attracting the best talent to public sector organizations. So, individuals, those who are of highest integrity, those who aspire to be ethical, those who aspire to lead a moral life, would be more attracted toward public institutions if they are institutions of probity, nothing else. Now, let's talk about what are the ways to inculcate probity. We have discussed all about them in our ethics classes and in your governance classes as well. I'm sure that a lot of discussion has happened on that topic of how probity in governance can be ensured. How can we ensure ethical governance? है ना, तो बहुत सारी चीजें जो हम जानते हैं, कुछ measures लिख लीजिएगा. Measures to inculcate probity in governance. Effective implementation of effective implementation of RTI, effective implementation of RTI as well as suo motu disclosures. एज वेल एज suo motu disclosures. खुद से ही जब गवर्नमेंट डिपार्टमेंट डिस्क्लोजर करने लगे, ट्रांसपेरेंसी स्टैंडर्ड अडॉप्ट करने लगे, एज वेल एज suo motu disclosures to ensure openness and transparency. Suo motu disclosures to ensure openness and transparency. Then conflict of interest can also arise at a lot of times while you are working in the organization. Where is that you have a conflict of interest in your duty and between your work, between your duty and your private interests. Let's say that your nephew is appearing in front of you in an interview for a government job. So that's a conflict of interest. So now, civil servants, in order to ensure probity in governance, must be trained firstly to identify situations of conflict of interest, and secondly, how to deal with those situations of conflict of interest in the best interest of probity in governance. So please write down, civil servants must be trained. Civil servants must be trained to identify conflict of interests, to identify conflict of interests and find effective solutions to them, keeping public interests in mind, or keeping public interest as priority. Find effective solutions to them, keeping public interest in mind. और क्या तरीके हो सकते हैं? Social audit. You can write social audit can be one of the ways to ensure probity in governance. Setting up of Lokpal, Lokayukta, effective functioning of these institutions. In fact, setting up तो हो ही गया है. Effective functioning of Lokpal and Lokayukta. Autonomy to investigation agencies such as the CBI, police. Autonomy to investigation agencies such as the CBI, police, etc. So can we be providing more autonomy to institutions such as CBI, police, that are supposed to conduct investigation into cases of corruption, allegations of misconduct by the government officials? Next, deployment of technology. Deployment of technology, है ना, इंफॉर्मेशन. देखिए मैं ब्रॉड पॉइंट्स लिखवा रहा हूं, इसके अंदर डिटेल वगैरह हम पहले भी बहुत सारी चीजों में डिस्कस कर चुके हैं, और भी जो आपके गवर्नेंस वगैरह की क्लासेस के अंदर जो आपने पढ़ा है, यू इनकॉर्पोरेट ऑल ऑफ दोस थिंग्स ना. प्लीज डोंट एक्सपेक्ट कि मैं पूरा सब कुछ एकदम सब कुछ आपको स्क्रैच से लिखवाऊं या बताएं इसको हम. एंड देन यू कैन ऑल्सो टॉक अबाउट से फॉर एग्जाम्पल योर सिटीजन चार्टर, राइट टू सर्विसेज एक्ट, है ना, सेवोत्तम मॉडल, जो भी सारे मेजर्स आप जानते हैं, ऑल ऑफ दोज यू कैन टॉक अबाउट. राइट. सो दिस इज अबाउट प्रोबिटी इन गवर्नेंस एज अ टॉपिक. कुछ बहुत ज्यादा नहीं है इसके ऊपर. जो क्वेश्चंस आए भी हैं एग्जाम में, वो यूपीएससी ने बस एक या तो ऐसे 5 मार्कर दे दिया, प्रोबिटी इन गवर्नेंस एक्सप्लेन करो, या अगर कुछ ऐसा दिया भी तो दे आस्क्ड अगेन वही सेम, यही सब चीजें पूछी है. व्हाट डू यू अंडरस्टैंड बाय प्रोबिटी इन गवर्नेंस, हाउ कैन बी एंश्योर प्रोबिटी इन गवर्नेंस, व्हाट आर चैलेंजेस टू प्रोबिटी इन गवर्नेंस, व्हाट आर चैलेंजेस, वही जो व्हाट आर चैलेंजेस टू एथिकल गवर्नेंस, वही तो है, और कुछ अलग थोड़ी ना है. सो इट्स द सेम थिंग ओनली, जस्ट कीप दैट इन माइंड. As I said, what is integrity to an individual, probity is to an institution. Clear? Can we proceed? So last topic is ethics in international relations. If you see last 3-4 years, you will find that every year there would be one question related to this topic in the mains examination. Ethics in IR. अब एक तो चीज ध्यान रखिएगा कि मैं आपको एथिकल पर्सपेक्टिव पढ़ा रहा हूं IR का, कुछ एथिकल तरीके से इन इश्यूज को कैसे डील करना है, पर your knowledge of international relations is as important in answering questions related to ethics in IR, because ultimately examples that you will write or conflicts that you will write about will be from IR. Now it can't be possible for me to cover up all the issues of, let's say, ethical issues with respect to terrorism, or ethical issues with respect to climate change, or ethical issues with respect to, let's say, Israel and Palestine conflict, or ethical issues with respect to Russia-Ukraine crisis, or ethical issues with respect to Rohingya crisis, और रेफ्यूजी क्राइसिस इन यूरोप, मैं ये चीजें नहीं कवर कर रहा हूं, है ना, बट एक्सपेक्टेड क्या है कि आप लोगों ने जो भी अपनी आईआर की क्लासेस में पढ़ा है या जो आप पढ़ेंगे, आपकी आईआर की क्लासेस हो गई है ना, सो वॉट एवर यू हैव स्टडीड इन योर आईआर क्लासेस, you will use that knowledge along with the ethical lens, ethical dimensions to answer the questions when it comes in paper 4 of general studies. हर साल एक क्वेश्चन मिल रहा है पिछले 4-5 साल से, पर बहुत ज्यादा कोई ऐसा रॉकेट साइंस टाइप का क्वेश्चन नहीं पूछता है, वो बहुत बेसिक सिंपल क्वेश्चन ही पूछता है. तो पहले तो ये जानते हैं व्हाट डू वी अंडरस्टैंड बाय एथिक्स इन इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस. Ethics in international relations is nothing but essentially application of morality, application of ethical standards while taking decisions in the international sphere. Basically, basing your foreign policy on ethical considerations, moral principles is what is called as ethics in IR or ethics in international relations. Now, why is it important to apply ethical principles or moral principles in your foreign policy aspects? Because often there is a gap in what the national interest of any country asks a country to achieve and what ethically a country should do. देखिए, इंडिया को क्या रशिया के खिलाफ यूएन जनरल असेंबली में वोट करना चाहिए ऑन दी रशिया यूक्रेन क्राइसिस? If we look at it from our national interest perspective, we should not, because they are a defense partner, because they are a very close strategic ally of India. We depend on them for so many things. But ethically, should we do so? Yes, because as a nation, we don't support resolution of any boundary issues, resolution of any international dispute through war. That has always been our policy as a nation since inception. So अब कॉन्फ्लिक्ट है किस चीज में? आपको जो एथिकली करना चाहिए और आपका नेशनल इंटरेस्ट क्या चाह रहा है उसमें. अब इस सिचुएशन को हम कैसे डील करें? हाउ डू वी डील विद दीज ट्रिकी सिचुएशंस इज व्हाट ethics in IR can possibly help us with. So what did India do? India abstained from voting at the UN General Assembly, and we issued a strong statement because we could not have afforded to be making enemies out of Russia. We can't. But at the same time, we can't support their actions as well. So if we had voted formally against them, it would have cost us. So we didn't vote formally. We didn't vote in favor of them as well. We just abstained. But we side by side issued a strong statement stating that India is not in favor of resolution of any such disputes between countries of the world through such a manner. अब same Israel conflict में भी अगर आप देखेंगे, you see India, for example, what happened in अभी 2 दिन पहले, that entire Iran and Pakistan issue. Now look at India's statement. How India has not said that, oh, Iran has done a great thing, they have bound Pakistan. Because see, you have to understand, no, we can't be openly supporting an action like that. But what we have said is that we understand the position with which countries go through when they have to face terrorism. And then in self-defense, countries have to take actions in order to overcome problems such as terrorism. It's a diplomatic statement that we have made, which is very heavily loaded with ethics and moral principles which India believes in. But yet, at the same time, we have not necessarily advocated कि हाँ जाके बम फोड़ दो, है ना? Or not, we are not saying कि yes, go carry out violence against your neighboring states. You get the point? So, therefore, it is this way we balance the diplomacy in IR, we balance our foreign policy with concerns of national interest as well as ethical concerns is what is essentially ethics in IR is all about. So I have mentioned here definition of ethics in IR. It refers to the application of morality and principles in solving the various ethical dilemmas that a country faces in conduct of its international relations with various countries. So it is nothing but essentially application of morality and principles in solving the various ethical dilemmas in IR. मतलब ethical dilemmas international relations में भी exist करते हैं. The basic issues that country face in international relations is, what is that ethical dilemma is? How to reconcile national interest with the values that country believes in. Most countries claim their commitment to universal values and try their best to adhere to, but on many occasions they find it difficult because of their national interests. Right? Now, what is national interest of any nation? National interest of any nation is goals, objectives of any nation in military, culture, and economic sphere. A country's goals and most effective ways to achieve them are determined by its national interest. Power equations in international arena are typically seen as a zero sum game. बहुत बार हम ये देखते हैं कि एक की हार है दूसरे की जीत है. That is what zero sum game is. In international arena we say that if one country wins, the other loses. Right? In which one country's loss is usually seen as other country's gain. As a result, every nation is competing to accumulate more power, including both hard and soft power. The will to power exists to influence bilateral relations, multilateral institutions, and issues of equal importance to all nations. The resistance to UNSC reforms is a prime example of this. So countries resist UNSC reforms. They don't want to expand UNSC. Why? Because of national interest. Why? Because they believe that now they will have to share power with other nations. However, considering the global commons, the will to power must be replaced by rationality, yet responsibility. Everyone has the duty to work towards universal human concerns. In international ethics, deontological ethics focus on moral duty that each kind of international actor bears towards each other. Kantian view of international ethics emphasize that nations should follow morality in international relations because it is their duty to do so, because it will help in preserving international peace and order. Then, the best example of rationality in countries displaying principles of moral duty is willingness of country to give certain sovereign space for establishment of multilateral institutions and formation of the UN Charter. So, countries became a part of UN with the idea of letting go of some of their sovereignty. That is an example of how ethics in international relations exactly work. You let go of some of your national interest for the larger goal of the mankind, for the larger goal of preserving peace and global cooperation on the earth. Right? So all of those things have been mentioned here. Indragopal Gujral doctrine adopted by India is a prime example of what is an approach to ethics in international relations. Non-aligned movement by India is, which India led, is also an example of ethics in international relation approach, because Nehru was a firm believer that we are not here to serve either the interests of the West or that of the Soviet bloc. We have our own problems. Let us first solve them. The developing world, the South, the countries that were till recently colonized, the ones that have recently got independence, these nations, these countries should not be attaching importance to either Soviet or to the NATO bloc. Rather, they have their own problems of poverty. Rather, they have their own problems of hunger. They have their own problems of health, education to be solved. And that is what they should focus their efforts on. Right? So, I hope all of you know about the Gujral doctrine and all of those things. I don't need to explain those things to you. So, India as a nation has always given precedence to its moral duty. Adoption of Panchsheel principles as a part of our foreign policy is also nothing but an example of ethics in international relations shown by India. Now, the question is that what are the sources on the basis of which a country can determine some of the ethics in international relations? Like, on what basis can a country determine certain morals, ethical values that they should follow in international relations? One is UN Declaration of Human Rights, that can always serve as the North Star for nations to follow as to ensure adherence to ethical values and principles in their diplomatic relationship. Second could be Geneva Convention for Humanitarian Treatment in War, could be Refugee Convention of 1951, the principles agreed upon in the Paris deal for the UNFCCC climate change meetings, then the agreements, the principles that have been laid down by organizations such as the WTO, or the principles that are a part of the TRIPS Convention, or for that matter, various international laws, treaties that have India has become a signatory to, whether it is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, whether it is the United Nations Convention on Laws of Seas, or whether it is the Vienna Convention, whatever, which any of these conventions that we talk about that India is a signatory to, all of these can be sources for identifying a way in which the countries must conduct their international relations to ensure an ethical approach in IR. Right? Now, why is ethics in international relation required? What is the requirement for ethics in international relation? Just write it down in short, even though things have been already mentioned here, but just still write it down in short. Importance or need for ethics in international relations. Need for ethics in international relation. So, see, one of the things with respect to ensuring ethics in international relation is because as of now, if you look at globally, there is no specific one institution that determines the ethical behavior on part of the nations today. See, perhaps maybe 30-40 years back, UN was a forceful nation, but today UN has become very weak. Many countries don't even follow the dictum laid down by the United Nations. So it has become a very weak institution. In absence of having one single legal authority that determines the ethical conduct of nations, it has become important that nations themselves must adopt an ethical approach. So therefore, first point you can write down is absence of a common global authority, of a common global authority of a common global authority to enforce ethical values and principles. To enforce ethical values and principles. Right? So this is one. Secondly, emerging global issues such as terrorism, refugee crisis, emerging global issues such as terrorism, refugee crisis, climate change require effective participation with ethical considerations by various countries. Next, please write down problems such as organized crime, drug trafficking, problems such as organized crime, drug trafficking, alleviation of poverty and hunger, require a coordinated approach require a coordinated approach by various nations. Require a coordinated approach by various nations. And only an ethical approach. And only an ethical approach can help in finding peaceful resolution to such issues. And last point, international relations and diplomacy. International relations and diplomacy can have wide ramifications. Can have wide ramifications on faraway lands. Can have wide ramifications on faraway land. And therefore require a careful ethical analysis. And therefore require a careful ethical analysis. मतलब कि जो इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस, फॉरेन पॉलिसी, डिप्लोमेसी केवल उसी नेशन को अफेक्ट नहीं करती है, बट लाखों और लोगों को भी अफेक्ट करती है, दोज हू मे बी लिविंग इन फार अवे कंट्रीज. And therefore it is important that decisions must be taken in such a manner that they involve ethical consideration. For example, see, if America is involved in creating or is involved in burning greenhouse gases or greenhouse emissions, let's say, it is not only having ramification on America, it is having ramification on countries in Polynesia, in Micronesia. It is having ramification on small island countries such as Maldives, or for that matter, low-lying countries such as Netherlands or Bangladesh. So therefore, in international relations, the activity must be carried out in such a manner that these basic ethical principles are given due consideration. Now, what are the various approaches to resolve the ethical dilemmas in international relation? देखिए, तीन major approaches हैं. By the way, मैंने यहाँ पे कुछ example भी दिया हुआ है for how application of ethics can be made in international relations with respect to the Second World War or in case of America as well. So you please read it on your own. Now, what are the various major approaches to resolve the ethical dilemmas when it comes to international relations? See, one major approach is that of realism, where a country gives utmost importance to their national interests while resolving any kind of ethical dilemma that they face in the IR. So, most countries' approach in international politics is that on realism. It assumes that IR should be guided by national self-interest. According to this approach, morality is not such an important consideration in the way a government or a nation conducts its foreign policy. In fact, what should motivate or guide a nation's action is its own self-interest. Second approach, of course, is the idealistic approach, where you say that for us, values and principles are the most important. And even if it means voting against Russia in UN General Assembly, who is our defense partner, we will do so because we stand for a particular set of values and it doesn't matter to us even if it angers our strategic ally or our defense partner. So that is what is idealism. Ideals such as peace, human rights, global justice, according to this, people, goals and means of foreign policy should be based on morality. और तीसरा अप्रोच है प्रिंसिपल रियलिज्म, जहां पे आप दोनों को बैलेंस करने की कोशिश करते हो, वेयर यू से दैट वी विल बी रियलिस्टिक yet at the same time we will try to resolve the international issue with certain values and principles balanced with our practical interests, right? So that is what is called as principal realism approach. अब इसी को अगर हम सपोज कीजिए किसी एक कंट्री को एक प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व करनी हो ऑफ ethics in international relation, एक ethical dilemma है whether we should provide aid to this country. Say for example, Pakistan is suffering from COVID. Now Pakistan has been involved in sponsoring terrorism in India. Should we be providing vaccines to Pakistan when we have developed our own vaccine much earlier than them? and save lives in Pakistan, or should we not? Right? Or say, for example, that we are seeing that there is a crisis that is happening in our neighboring country, let's say Bangladesh, and what was happening in 71. Now, should we violate our own principles of non-interference into the domestic matters of the other country and invade East Pakistan, or just keep quiet and just follow what it works for us? So whether we should follow this or that. So there are various ways to resolve those issues, है ना? So एक तरीका तो ये है कि आप end based consequentialist Jeremy Bentham वाला approach लेके चलिएगा, where you say that action should be judged by the outcomes. So, for example, reliance on nuclear deterrence by US during the Cold War, where the US tried to deter Soviet aggression with the threat of nuclear retaliation based on consequences. You know? So, India's decision to develop nuclear weapons can be justified ethically because the end goal of it was to just create a deterrence for our enemies to use nuclear weapons against us. In fact, a lot of people say that actually development of nuclear weapons has made the world a much more peaceful place. Why? Because now everyone knows that the other country also has a nuclear weapon. So if I use it against them, they would also use it against me, and then there will be assured destruction mutually of both the countries. So what is the point of using a nuclear weapon? That's why often countries do not escalate conflicts into full-blown wars between each other today, because of the very same reason. Secondly, rule-based approach or deontological approach. So you say that it doesn't matter what the consequences of the result of the action are going to be. We should judge the ethicality of an action on the basis of the rules or the policy that we are supposed to follow. For example, in 1921-22, US provided famine relief to Soviet Union even as the US was trying to weaken the new Soviet regime. So consequence, चाहे जो भी हो, पर as a nation, the US believed that it was their duty to provide help to the people, those who were starving in the Soviet Union. And then the third one is, of course, one could say a marriage of these two concepts. You can also use the virtue-based approach of Aristotle, right? So that also can be used, that you should be good, not because of ends or because of your duty. You should be good because the world would survive if nations behave in a good manner. You should be good because following principles and values is what would essentially ensure that if everyone does that, that is what would ensure the global peace and cooperation, right? So those are some of the things. Then plus, apart from it, what are some of the elements, what are some of the principles that a country should keep in mind to ensure that their approach towards ethical dilemmas in international relation is ethical in nature? So जब भी आप ethics in international relations के किसी भी questions को solve करें, इन कुछ principles को आप refer कर सकते हैं while writing answer to any case study, or while talking about how to resolve a particular ethical dilemma faced by a nation. One is that at the core of any country's international relation, at the core of any country's foreign diplomacy, human rights should be given utmost importance. Human lives, human rights should be forming the most important basis of any decision that is taken by a nation in the sphere of international relations. Secondly, nations must commit to multilateralism, must commit to resolution of disputes through dialogue-based approach by getting multiple stakeholders, multiple countries on the same platform. So commitment to multilateralism, prosperity, as well as sustainability, environmental concerns, etc. Third is that countries must also ensure that they should not face, or they should be not ready to accept any kind of injustice that exists across the globe. So any country's foreign policy should be driven by this consideration as well, that whatever foreign policy decision we take should not result in injustice to any people. So that is another thing. And then principle of sacrifice, which is, if it is in the power of any nation to prevent something very bad from happening, for example, death due to starvation or genocide, without thereby sacrificing any of the comparable moral significant values, then you have to do it. For example, India could have prevented a genocide in East Pakistan by interfering in the internal matters of Pakistan, even though it came at the cost of possibly violating our own principle of Panchsheel. But we did so because a larger value or a larger goal of being able to ensure the protection of the lives of certain individuals was involved. Right? So these are some of the elements that should be followed with respect to ethics in international relation by any particular nation or by any country. Now, what are some of the challenges or what are some of the ethical issues that are coming up in the IR in the recent times? See, one is neocolonialism. Various countries have started to invest funds, money in developing countries, not with the aim of actually doing this for some altruistic purpose, but they do it for an ulterior motive, so as to gain more power for themselves, so as to be able to capture more power over the other nations. So that is one. Second is issues of human rights violation being ignored by countries at their convenience. So often you would find another issue that we face in international relations today in terms of IR, ethics in IR, is that various countries would shout at the top of their roof if they find any kind of violation of human rights happening in certain specific geographies or countries. But when the same violation of human rights happens, when it is discomforting for them to speak about it, they keep mum about it. Pakistan would be the first one to talk about the minority rights, especially, let's say, of anything happens to Muslims in India, they would be the first one to raise a voice about it. But they haven't raised a single voice about what has been happening to Uyghurs in China, in Xinjiang. No concern has been raised by them about the same. If you look at America, they would cry about the rights of women, let us say, or rights of downtrodden, or rights of minorities in different parts of the world and how they are being exploited. But they don't talk about the kind of discrimination which the blacks in their own country are subjected to. Right? So again, the point that I'm trying to make is that various issues of human rights violations are ignored by nations simply because of what suits them or what does not. Another problem that we face is the lack of responsibilities that is taken by various countries as far as the global commons are concerned. So Russia or United States of America have been at the forefront, even China now have been at the forefront of creating a lot of space debris. The problem is that space does not belong to any one country. When you are creating such amount of space debris, ultimately the other developing countries which are yet in these or which are yet to set up their own satellites, which are yet to send their own spacecraft to the space, would start doing so. They would start facing difficulties because the space and the orbit would have already been occupied by the other countries and the debris which has been created by the satellites of the other countries. So should they not be responsible as to how they use the global commons? Then apart from it, international diplomacy is guided by narrow national interest rather than common global agenda. For example, if you look at the issue of declaring Maulana Masood Azhar as an international terrorist, ideally, if you look at China's official position or stance on terrorism, they are strictly against terrorism. But at the same time, when the vote came up in UNSC to declare Maulana Masood Azhar as a declared international terrorist, China vetoed this particular proposal. So why are they doing so when they stand against terrorism? Are they doing so because of their narrow national interest? So that is another thing. And then of course, nations often support international terrorism depending upon where they are. For example, USA has a problem with the Palestinian terrorist organizations, but it does not have a problem in supporting similar kind of organizations in Syria. Right? They may have a problem with Palestinian self-determination movement, but they don't have a problem with similar kind of self-determination movement that are happening in some other parts of the Middle East. So the point is that you support international terrorism as well, or you support terrorism as well, depending upon your own convenience. It cannot be a matter of convenience. So these are some of the examples of ethical issues that exist in international relations. I have also mentioned some of the other ethical issues as well with respect to, let's say, terrorism is also another ethical issue, or stand of various nations, good versus bad terrorists, etc., and all of that. Then refugee crisis. Often you would see that European countries are the first one to be raising voice over the human right violations, human right concerns. But when several refugees were trying to make their way from Syria and from some of the North African and Middle East countries to Europe in situation of crisis, the European nations themselves turned down these refugees because of their inability to take them. Now, at the same time, they support India to intake the Rohingya refugees, but they are themselves not willing to take the refugees that are coming in from Syria into their own nation. So again, an example of how there are double approaches which are adopted by various nations or ethical issues that come up with respect to the international relations. तो उसी के respect में मैंने कुछ चीजें mention भी की हुई है. मैंने ये asylum, refugee law के respect में एक पूरा यहाँ पे I have provided one particular short note, so you can read it with respect to ethical issues in refugee crisis as well. Similarly, I have provided ethical issues with international aid also. For example, I'll just run through this. I'm not going through this in detail. So what are the ethical issues with international aid? See, to provide international aid to another country with an altruistic purpose is great. With the purpose of improving the lives of the other people is great. But if it is done with the narrow intention of trying to drive your own self-interest, or when it is done with the narrow intention of promoting only one single culture or one single definition of democracy in other countries, that is where the problem lies. Or if it is when you are trying to determine the foreign policy or domestic policies of a country with the help of the foreign aid that you are providing. For example, India banned several Chinese apps and made FDI through government routes mandatory for investment from neighboring countries. Or modern technologies are preserved for profit motives. So बहुत बार what UN, World Bank, etc. would do is that they would come out with various research papers and they would suggest to various countries to adopt certain specific technologies. And they say that this would help in sustainability, this would help in cleaner environment, this would help in reduced greenhouse emissions, etc. But then when these countries would ask the UN or the World Bank for, let's say, aid, UN or World Bank would provide them aid, but at one condition for procuring of these technologies, that you will procure these technologies from some specific XYZ company. So again, there is an ethical issue which is involved in international funding. आप पैसा दे तो रहे हो, पर्पस के लिए भी अच्छे पर्पस के लिए दे रहे हो, but there is a problem. You are promoting narrow interest of one particular corporate entity or some other specific corporate entity over the competition or over the spirit of liberalism that you generally tend to talk about. So all of those things I have mentioned here. Then I have also talked about that how a nation can use ethical approach in enhancing, in widening its comprehensive national power. How can a nation use ethical perspective in expanding their human capital? How they can expand their comprehensive national power in soft power with respect to by using ethical approach, or they can also use it for the social harmony. Then I have also provided that can there be certain ethical justifications for a war as well. This also there is something called as a just war theory, which lays down what are the 6 conditions in which a war can be justified by a nation. Those conditions also I have laid down here. You can read it on your own, right? So this is broadly what is there with respect to ethics in international relations. What I would suggest is that apart from the handout, you please refer the previous year questions and secondly your material. ये तीनों चीजें आप यूज करिएगा, and plus whatever you are reading in the newspapers with respect to international relations and whatever your coverage is, that should be more than enough. Usually questions are very simple. जैसे उसने एक बार क्वेश्चन दिया था जो अभी हम बात कर रहे थे कि various democratic countries, even though they profess their allegiance to values such as human right, democracy, etc., but they themselves are involved in turning down various refugees. What are some of the ethical concerns associated with such steps taken by nations, etc.? तो इस तरीके का क्वेश्चन था. या फिर उन्होंने रशिया यूक्रेन वॉर के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में ही पूछ लिया कि कैन यू जस्टिफाई द वॉर बाय रशिया ऑन सर्टेन ग्राउंड्स एक्सेट्रा एंड ऑल ऑफ दैट. सो क्वेश्चंस आर वेरी सिंपल, just that you have to write them from a ethical lens, as I said at the beginning itself, while you are attempting such questions. So वो बस दिमाग में रखिएगा. So therefore, please do have a look at the material and some of the sample answer questions, etc. also that have been provided in your material. Okay, so this brings me to an end for the classes for ethics in governance. I just hope that if nothing, you have at least got the fodder material and an idea of how to approach the questions in this particular segment of ethics. And ultimately, you must remember that whatever we have discussed in our classes is not enough. Why? Because it is an ever evolving topic. Questions that are asked are very dynamic in nature, and UPSC expects you to apply basic principles but with your own understanding. So जो क्लास में सीखा है उसको अप्लाई कीजिएगा rather than बस just उसको लिख डालने से better. So also one thing which I told you at the beginning of the classes itself, if you have to do well in ethics paper, one simple strategy is pick up previous year's questions from 2013 onwards, solve all the questions properly of ethics and write 2 to 4 tests of ethics. That is proper paper 4 tests before you go into the examination. अगर आप इतना भी basic करेंगे, I assure you that you will score 100 plus marks. Plus एक और जो चीज आपको करनी चाहिए वो कुछ टॉपर्स की आंसर कॉपीज जो मैंने आपको पहले भी बोला था, observe them, see how they are writing the answers, see what their approach is, and see if you can learn something from there as well as to how to improve your answer writing in ethics. बस ये 3 चीजें आप ढंग से कर लीजिएगा, you will definitely get 100 plus in ethics. There is absolutely no doubt, but you have to do these 3 things in a diligent manner. Right? I have also, I think someone had given their essay to me. No? Who was that? किसी ने essay दिया था इस batch में for comment something. नहीं दिया था इस आपके batch में नहीं दिया था क्या किसी ने? Or maybe some student had given then absent anyway. So fine, I'll figure out who that is. So in case if you want any help with respect to ethics, polity, any other subject as well generally, so I'm leaving my email ID, right? You can reach out to me here. Otherwise, I think the best way, especially for the offline students, to reach out to me is you come to me in between the classes. Of course, अगर 1 बजे क्लास है आप 12:45 पे आएंगे, then it will be difficult for me to entertain you. But you can come at 12 o'clock, possibly wait for 5-10 minutes here and there, and then we can meet. Or let's say if I have a class from 1 to 4 and 5 to 8, you can come at 4 o'clock or whatever. So you can, वो आपको देखना पड़ेगा मेरी कौन से center में class है and all of that. That I can't necessarily promise you, but you can send me a mail as well and we can possibly see when we can meet. Okay, so these are 2 of my email IDs. And in case you need any kind of assistance, you may write. Please be a bit patient while you write the email because it usually, I receive a lot of mails. So it usually takes me time to respond to mails. So please understand that I have that limitation that it's only me who's answering those mails and there is no one else. I have not kept any assistant for writing the answers to these mails. So you please be a bit patient while writing mails to me. Right? Any questions, any doubts that you have? on anything related to whatever we have discussed. Okay, handouts वगैरह जो भी है वो, I hope that all of those have been uploaded and all of that is sorted out. I don't have anything from my end. Right, so wishing all of you all the very best, and do well and stay in touch. And if you need any help, always feel free to reach out. Right, thank you so much.